The Ottoman Empire, spanning more than 6 centuries, was one of the most powerful empires in history. Known for its military conquests, grand mosques, and glittering palaces, the empire also hid behind its glory a horrifying secret: the lives of countless women who were enslaved. These women were not treated as human beings. They were treated as property, bought and sold in markets, locked behind palace walls, forced into submission by powerful men who saw them not as individuals, but as objects of desire, status, and control. What makes this even more disturbing is that these practices were considered normal. Society accepted them. The empire thrived while the suffering of women was hidden beneath the carpets of its majestic halls. And even today, the whispers of those untold stories send shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to uncover them. In this video, we will dive into the horrific things that female slaves endured in the Ottoman Empire, practices that were normalized, accepted, and celebrated by those in power. From their capture, to their training, to the darkest rituals inside the Sultan's harem, we will uncover the painful truths that history tried to bury. They were young, vulnerable, and powerless. Taken from their homes, separated from their families, and forced into lives they could not escape. For thousands of women during the reign of the Ottoman Empire, slavery was not an exception, was the norm. Behind the magnificent palaces, beyond the grand mosques, and hidden inside the Sultan's harem, the daily lives of women were filled with pain, submission, and horrors that society accepted as completely normal. The Ottoman Empire ruled for more than 600 years. Its armies conquered vast lands, its rulers built mosques that still stand today, and its sultans shaped history itself. But beneath this power and glory lay one of the darkest systems in human history: the enslavement of women. These women were not treated as people. They were treated as property. They were bought, sold, and controlled. Their worth was judged by their youth, their beauty, and their ability to please powerful men. The beginning of this nightmare started with capture. Soldiers raided villages in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and North Africa. Women and young girls were torn from their homes, dragged away in chains, and marched across long distances toward markets where their fates would be decided. Families cried, but their voices meant nothing against the empire's hunger for control and power. The slave markets were brutal. Women were displayed openly, inspected like animals, and sold to the highest bidder. Their bodies were examined for signs of beauty and health, every flaw noted as if they were livestock. Youth meant higher value. Innocence meant higher price. Buyers, wealthy nobles, generals, merchants, and even agents of the palace, would argue fiercely over who would take which girl home. Once sold, a woman's past was erased. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a sister. She was property. For many, their destination was the palace. But even inside the walls of luxury, the reality was grim. These women were forced into strict training programs designed to break them down and rebuild them into obedient figures. Their names were replaced with new ones, often given by their masters. Their native languages were suppressed, and they were punished if they failed to adapt. Their old identities disappeared. They were trained in music, poetry, dancing, and manners. On the surface, it appeared like education, but it was never for their benefit. Every lesson was meant to shape them into perfect servants of power. They were expected to walk gracefully, to smile when commanded, to hide all emotions except those that pleased their masters. Their bodies were treated with oils, perfumes, and carefully monitored diets, not to give them dignity but to make them desirable. There was no room for mistakes. Disobedience meant punishment, sometimes physical, sometimes psychological, but always harsh. A single slip could mean being sold again, cast out, or forced into the lowest ranks of servitude. The women who succeeded became favorites, sometimes concubines of powerful men, rewarded with jewelry and silks. But this so-called reward came at the cost of their freedom. They lived inside golden cages, trapped in a world where beauty was their curse. At the very top of this hierarchy stood the Sultan's harem, a place often misunderstood and romanticized. Popular stories describe it as a paradise of beauty and luxury. In reality, it was a prison with silken curtains and golden walls. Every move was watched. Rivalries between women were fierce, because the Sultan's attention could make or break a life. A woman chosen by the Sultan could rise to immense power, even becoming the mother of a future ruler. But those ignored or rejected slowly faded away, their lives wasted in endless waiting. The harem was a world of fear and control. Eunuchs, the guards of the harem, made sure no one stepped out of line. The women competed, manipulated, and sometimes betrayed one another, all for a single chance to be seen. It was survival in its cruelest form, hidden behind curtains of gold and velvet. What outsiders saw as luxury was, for the women trapped inside, endless submission. Their youth was spent behind locked doors, their voices silenced, their stories forgotten. Many never escaped, never saw their families again, never lived a life of their own choosing. So far we have seen how women were captured, sold, and forced into obedience. We have walked through the slave markets, the training chambers, and the Sultan's harem. But these are only the first layers of horror. The rituals, the punishments, the secrets that history has buried go even deeper. And those truths, when revealed, are even darker than what we have uncovered so far. The deeper we go into the daily lives of female slaves in the Ottoman Empire, the darker the truths become. What the outside world saw as glory, faith, and power was, in reality, built on the silent suffering of women whose voices were stolen. Let us peel back the curtains further. One of the most horrific aspects of their lives was the constant testing of loyalty and purity. Women were treated not only as property but as possessions that had to be inspected. Their bodies were often subjected to humiliating examinations to prove that they were untouched or worthy of serving inside the palace. This was not a one-time event. For many, it was repeated over and over, leaving scars not just on their bodies but on their souls. Imagine the fear of standing powerless while strangers judged your body, your innocence, and your very identity. And what happened if a woman was accused of disobedience? Punishment awaited. Sometimes it was isolation in dark chambers, sometimes flogging, and sometimes being sold again to harsher masters. The empire had perfected a system where fear ensured silence. A woman who dared to resist was quickly broken down until her will disappeared. But the cruelty did not end with punishment. It continued in the daily rituals of control. Meals were carefully monitored. Every movement was watched. Even sleep was not private, because attendants and guards ensured that no woman could escape or communicate secretly. Privacy was a luxury they would never know. Inside the Sultan's palace, the hierarchy of the harem was another silent weapon. Women were ranked like objects on a shelf. Some were chosen as personal attendants, others were trained for years in hopes of being noticed, and a few rose to positions of power as favorites or mothers of princes. But for every woman who rose, dozens were forgotten. They spent their youth waiting in endless corridors, their beauty fading, their lives wasted in the shadows. And yet, survival instincts created a cruel game inside the harem. Rivalries grew sharp. Jealousies festered. Alliances were made only to be broken. A woman could never fully trust another because everyone was fighting for the same prize: survival through power. It was a world where betrayal became normal. Sisters turned against sisters, friends became enemies, and kindness was rare. The empire designed it this way. By keeping women divided, they remained powerless against the system itself. Beyond the palace walls, life was no kinder. Female slaves sold to wealthy merchants or nobles often faced lives of silent torment. Some were forced into household labor, working endlessly with no hope of freedom. Others were used as concubines, trapped in homes where their worth depended solely on their beauty. If they failed to satisfy their masters, they could be discarded, beaten, or sold again. Their lives were fragile, their fates decided by men who held absolute power over them. And yet, in the middle of all this darkness, there were whispers of resistance. Some women managed to secretly pass messages, form bonds, and preserve their identities through memory and culture. They sang songs in hidden corners, spoke in coded words, and shared fragments of their past lives so they would not be forgotten. These small acts of defiance were dangerous, but they were the only way to hold on to humanity in a world designed to strip it away. The empire thrived on the silence of these women. The grand mosques, the powerful armies, the wealth of the sultans. All of it was built while thousands of women lived as shadows. History praised the rulers and generals, but the voices of these women remained buried. To this day, the stories of female slaves in the Ottoman Empire are rarely told, hidden behind layers of pride and denial. Let us now turn to the harem's most secret aspect, the system of breeding power. For many, the ultimate goal was to bear a son. A woman who gave birth to a prince could suddenly transform from a powerless slave into the mother of a future ruler. This created enormous pressure, and women often lived in fear of failure. If a woman bore no children, or worse, if she bore only daughters, her status plummeted. She could be pushed aside, ignored, or sent away. The empire reduced the sacred act of motherhood into a cold political tool. But bearing a child did not guarantee safety. In fact, it often placed women in even greater danger. The harem was a battlefield of politics. Mothers of princes competed against each other, knowing that only one son could inherit the throne. This meant that jealousy, sabotage, and even murder were not uncommon. Women were sometimes accused falsely, poisoned, or eliminated by rivals who sought to protect their own children's futures. Imagine living every day knowing that your food might be poisoned, that your friends might betray you, and that your survival depended on the cruel politics of succession. This dark system turned women into pawns of empire building. Their bodies were not their own. Their children were not their own. Everything belonged to the Sultan and the empire. Now let us ask the most haunting question: did they ever find freedom? For a small number, yes. Some women who bore powerful princes rose to positions of incredible influence. A few even ruled indirectly through their sons, shaping the politics of the empire from behind the scenes. They became powerful figures, remembered as queens or valide sultans. But even their power was tied to the men in their lives. It was never truly their own. For the majority, freedom never came. When they grew older and their beauty faded, they were often discarded, married off to lower officials, or left to live in obscurity. Their years of suffering were forgotten. They were replaced by younger women, and the cycle continued. What is most shocking is not just the cruelty of this system, but how normal it was. Society accepted it. Religion was used to justify it. Families watched their daughters stolen and said nothing, because they feared the empire's power. What we now see as horrific was, for centuries, considered ordinary. And that is the greatest tragedy of all, that unimaginable suffering was once accepted as daily life. As we look back, we must confront the uncomfortable truth. The Ottoman Empire, like many empires in history, thrived on exploitation. Behind the mosques and palaces that tourists admire today lies a history soaked in the tears of forgotten women. Their stories were silenced, their names erased, their lives reduced to whispers in the shadows. But today, by speaking these truths, we honor them. We give voice to the voiceless. We remember the women who were taken, broken, and silenced. Their suffering should never be forgotten, and their courage, however hidden, should inspire us to confront injustice wherever it exists. Because if we ignore these stories, if we allow them to remain hidden, then history repeats itself. And somewhere in the world today, another young girl may be living through the same nightmare, while the world looks away. This is the haunting legacy of the Ottoman Empire's female slaves. Their lives were not fairy tales. They were not romantic stories of exotic palaces. They were tales of survival, pain, and endurance. And the least we can do is remember them honestly, without the masks of glory or pride. So the next time you see the grand domes of Istanbul or hear stories of powerful sultans, remember the shadows that lived behind those walls. Remember the women who were forced into silence. Remember the horrific things that were once considered normal.